Grab your fork, welcome to Revenge Kitchen, tonight's special. The one who thought he'd never get caught. The first time I met Alina Whitmore, she was on her hands and knees in her front garden, dirt under her fingernails, coaxing life from stubborn roses that had seen better decades. That was 15 years ago, back when Millbrook Street still felt like a neighborhood instead of a real estate opportunity. "Garrett Thorne," I'd said, extending a calloused hand toward the silver-haired woman who couldn't have been taller than 5'4" soaking wet. She'd looked up at me with eyes sharp as cut glass, studying my face like she was reading my entire life story in the lines around my eyes. "Alina," she'd replied, accepting my handshake with surprising strength. "You're the one building the retaining wall for the Santos family." It wasn't a question. Alina knew everything that happened on our street, and more importantly, she cared about it. That caring would become the foundation of something beautiful, and ultimately, the catalyst for one of the most satisfying acts of revenge I've ever witnessed. Maya and Diego Santos had moved into 47 Millbrook Street in 2009, when their oldest daughter Carmen was barely walking, and Maya was pregnant with their second. The house was a weathered Victorian that had seen better days, creaking floorboards, a kitchen that belonged in a museum, and plumbing that sang opera every time you flushed the toilet. But for $400 a week, it was all they could afford in a city where rent prices climbed faster than Diego could earn promotions at the warehouse. Alina owned the house, along with 6 others scattered throughout the neighborhood. But unlike the soulless investment companies buying up properties left and right, Alina saw tenants as people, not profit margins. When Maya's third pregnancy coincided with Diego's temporary layoff, Alina froze their rent. When little Carlos was born with complications requiring expensive medical care, she froze it again. "Family comes first," she'd tell me during our Sunday morning conversations over the fence that separated her immaculate garden from my workshop. "Money's just paper, but a safe home for children, that's worth more than all the bank accounts in the world." Over 5 years, Maya and Diego transformed that rundown house into a home. They couldn't afford professional contractors, so I helped Diego learn basic electrical work and plumbing repairs. Maya painted every room herself, staying up late after the kids were asleep to create something beautiful from something forgotten. Their neighbors pitched in too. Ruby Chen taught Maya how to coax vegetables from the tiny backyard, while Tommy Morrison's wife Sarah passed down children's clothes and toys as the Santos family grew from 3 to 7. Alina watched it all with the satisfaction of someone who'd planted seeds and watched them bloom. "They're good people," she'd tell me, watching Diego teach his sons to fix the front gate he'd broken playing football. "The kind who make a neighborhood worth living in." That's why, when Alina approached Maya and Diego in 2014, the promise she made felt as solid as the foundation I'd helped Diego repair. "I want you to have this house," Alina had said, sitting at their kitchen table while 5-year-old Carlos showed her his drawings and baby Isabel slept in Maya's arms. "I'm getting older, and I want to know that when I'm gone, this place will stay with a family who loves it." The plan was simple. Maya and Diego would save for a down payment while Alina held the house off the market. When they had enough for a bank loan, she'd sell to them at fair market value, not the inflated prices speculators were paying, but what the house was actually worth to a family planning to live there for decades. Maya had cried that day, not the desperate tears of someone drowning in an impossible rental market, but tears of relief. For the first time since they'd moved to the city, they had something most young families could only dream of: hope for actual ownership, for building equity instead of just paying someone else's mortgage. The next 5 years passed in a blur of careful saving and patient planning. Diego took every overtime shift the warehouse offered. Maya started a small catering business, making traditional Filipino food for office parties and family celebrations. They lived on rice and beans more often than they cared to admit, but every sacrifice felt worthwhile because it brought them closer to that impossible dream, owning their own home. I watched their discipline with admiration that bordered on awe. When other families went on vacations, the Santos family spent weekends at free parks and municipal pools. When neighbors upgraded their cars or renovated their kitchens, Maya and Diego drove their ancient Honda and made do with the avocado green appliances that came with the house. "Every dollar counts," Maya would tell me when I'd stop by with leftover materials from construction jobs, hoping to help with small repairs. We're not just saving for a house, we're saving for our children's future. By early 2019, they'd done it. $28,000 in a savings account that had started with loose change and a coffee can. Enough for a down payment, enough to convince a bank that this hardworking family deserved a chance at the American dream. Maya called Alina on a Tuesday morning in March, her voice shaking with excitement and nervousness. "Mrs. Whitmore, we're ready. We have the money for the down payment and the bank pre-approved us for the loan." Alina's response was everything Maya had hoped for. "Wonderful, dear. Let me call my lawyer this week and we'll get the paperwork started. You've waited long enough." But Alina Whitmore never made that call. She suffered a massive stroke that Thursday morning, collapsing in the same garden where I'd first met her 15 years earlier. Ruby Chen found her 3 hours later, surrounded by the roses she'd spent decades nurturing. Alina died in the hospital that evening, conscious just long enough to squeeze Maya's hand and whisper, "Don't let them take it from you." At the time, none of us understood what those words meant. The first sign of trouble came disguised as reassurance. 3 weeks after Alina's funeral, Maya received a phone call from someone who introduced herself as Victoria Pemberton Hayes, Alina's eldest daughter. Victoria's voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to boardrooms and decisive action, but she spoke with what seemed like genuine sympathy about the family's arrangement with her mother. "I want you to know that we absolutely intend to honor Mother's promise," Victoria had said, while Maya held the phone with trembling hands and gestured frantically for Diego to come listen. "Of course, we'll need to wait for probate to settle. You understand legal requirements and all that, but the sale will proceed exactly as Mother planned." Relief flooded through the Santos household like water through a broken dam. Carmen, now 15 and their oldest, had been devastated by the possibility of losing the only home she'd ever known. 10-year-old Marcus had asked his parents every day since Alina's death whether they'd have to move, while 8-year-old Carlos and 6-year-old Isabel were too young to fully understand the threat, but old enough to sense their parents' anxiety. "She seemed so nice," Maya told me the next day as we stood in her kitchen watching Diego teach Carlos how to replace a leaky faucet. "She understood how much this house means to us. She said they're wealthy enough that they don't need to worry about a few $1,000s here or there." I should have felt the same relief flooding through me. Instead, something cold settled in my stomach, a construction worker's instinct honed by years of dealing with contractors who promised the world and delivered broken dreams. "What do you know about these kids of Alina's?" I asked. Maya shrugged, wiping down counters that were already spotless. "Mrs. Whitmore mentioned them sometimes, but not often. I think they all moved away years ago, built their own lives. She said they were successful, but—" Maya paused, searching for the right words. "I got the impression they weren't particularly close." That impression, I would later learn, was a masterpiece of understatement. The Pemberton Hayes siblings had indeed built successful lives, but their success was measured exclusively in stock portfolios and property values. Victoria, the eldest at 48, ran a real estate investment firm that specialized in maximizing return potential from residential properties. Edmund, 2 years younger, was a corporate lawyer whose client list read like a who's who of landlords and developers. The youngest, Patricia, had married into old money and spent her time managing family investments from her estate in Connecticut. What Maya didn't know, what none of us knew until it was almost too late, was that Alina's children had been pressuring her for years to sell her rental properties. They'd watched the gentrification creeping through their mother's neighborhood and calculated the fortunes to be made from families like the Santos. Mother was too sentimental, Victoria would later explain to a real estate agent, unaware that Ruby Chen was listening from the next booth at the coffee shop where they'd met. She let her emotions cloud her business judgment. "These people," Victoria's voice carried the particular disdain reserved for those who worked with their hands instead of their connections, "have been paying below-market rent for years. They've had their charity. Now it's time for the properties to reach their full potential." But in those first months after Alina's death, while probate wound its slow way through the courts, Victoria maintained the facade of benevolent cooperation. She even encouraged Maya and Diego to begin making small improvements to the house, suggesting it would help with the eventual sale. "Mother always said you had excellent taste," Victoria told Maya during one of their phone conversations. "Please, go ahead with any updates you'd like to make. Consider it an investment in your future home." Maya and Diego threw themselves into the project with the enthusiasm of people who finally saw light at the end of a very long tunnel. They spent evenings stripping decades-old wallpaper from the living room walls, revealing original hardwood that just needed refinishing. Diego learned to install new fixtures in the bathroom, while Maya researched paint colors that would brighten the dark Victorian interior without destroying its character. I helped where I could, bringing home leftover materials and lending tools for weekend projects. It felt good to see hope returning to the Santos household, to watch their children get excited about choosing paint colors for their bedrooms instead of worrying about where they'd sleep next year. "This is really happening," Maya told me one Saturday afternoon in August, as we stood back to admire the freshly painted living room walls. The soft yellow she'd chosen made the space feel twice as large and infinitely more welcoming. "After all these years, we're finally going to own our own home." I wanted to share her joy, I truly did. But the construction worker in me couldn't shake the feeling that we were building on sand. Something about Victoria's easy promises felt too smooth, too rehearsed. In my experience, people who inherit money rarely give it away willingly, regardless of what their parents might have wanted. That suspicion proved prophetic when Diego received a call from Victoria in late September. "Wonderful news," she'd said, her voice carrying the bright enthusiasm of someone delivering an early Christmas present. "Probate has finally settled. We can move forward with the sale immediately." Diego had whooped with joy, spinning Maya around their newly refinished kitchen while their children cheered. They called the bank that same afternoon to finalize their loan application, giddy with the knowledge that their years of sacrifice were finally paying off. Which is why the banks call the next morning hit like a sledgehammer to the solar plexus. "I'm sorry, Mr. Santos," the loan officer had said, his voice carrying the apologetic tone of someone delivering terminal diagnosis. "But there seems to be some confusion about the purchase price. The amount you've qualified for is significantly less than what the sellers are now asking." Diego's hand shook as he wrote down the numbers. The house they'd planned to buy for $180,000, the price Alina had quoted based on neighborhood comparables and family-friendly terms, was now listed at $260,000. An $80,000 increase overnight. Maya's scream of anguish echoed through the thin walls of 47 Millbrook Street, a sound of pure betrayal that cut through me like a rusty blade. I was in my backyard workshop when I heard it, and I dropped the wrench I'd been holding to sprint toward their house. I found Maya collapsed on her kitchen floor, Diego kneeling beside her with the phone still in his hand, and their 4 children clustered in the doorway, terrified by their mother's breakdown. "They lied to us," Maya sobbed, her words barely intelligible through her tears. "They lied to us for months. They let us spend our savings on improvements to a house they never intended to sell us. They let our children believe they were finally going to have a real home." But the betrayal was just beginning. "There's more," Diego said quietly, his voice hollow as a grave. "Victoria says the house is going on the open market next week. There's going to be an open house this Sunday, and given the current market conditions..." He couldn't finish the sentence. I finished it for him. "It'll probably sell immediately to the highest bidder." Maya's fresh sobs confirmed what we all knew. In a hot real estate market, a house priced $80,000 below comparable properties would attract bidding wars from investors and flippers looking for quick profits. The Santos family wouldn't just lose their dream home. They'd lose it to exactly the kind of people Alina had spent her life protecting them from. And with rent prices skyrocketing throughout the city, they'd probably be forced to move somewhere smaller, farther from Diego's job and the children's schools, starting over in their 40s with nothing to show for a decade of sacrifice except fresh paint on walls that would never be theirs. I stayed with the family that night, sleeping on their couch and listening to Maya cry herself to sleep while Diego stared at the ceiling, probably calculating and recalculating numbers that would never add up to enough. But as I lay there in the dark, surrounded by the evidence of their hope, family photos on freshly painted walls, children's artwork displayed with pride, small improvements made with love and care, something else began to burn in my chest alongside the sympathy. Rage. Pure, focused, constructive rage at people who had enough money to buy happiness for a dozen families, but chose instead to squeeze every possible dollar from those who had nothing left to give. Victoria Pemberton Hayes and her siblings didn't need that extra $80,000. Hell, they probably spent more than that on wine and vacation homes. But they were willing to destroy a family's decade-long dream for money that represented pocket change to people of their wealth. That kind of greed demanded consequences. And as I stared at the ceiling of the house Alina had wanted to become the Santos family's permanent home, I began to formulate a plan that would give Victoria Pemberton Hayes exactly what she deserved. Sunday morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that matches your mood when everything feels hopeless. Maya hadn't left her bedroom since Friday's phone call, and Diego moved through the house like a ghost, mechanically making breakfast for children who kept asking questions he couldn't answer. I knocked on their door at 8 a.m., carrying 2 large coffee cups and a folder thick with papers. "We need to talk," I told Diego, settling into the kitchen chair where Alina used to sit when she'd visit. "All of us." It took 20 minutes to coax Maya downstairs, and another 10 to convince the children to occupy themselves in the living room while the adults talked. When Maya finally sat down, her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, the look of someone whose faith in basic human decency had been systematically destroyed. "I've been thinking," I began, opening the folder and spreading its contents across their kitchen table, "about what Alina said in the hospital. Don't let them take it from you." Diego glanced at the papers, real estate listings, market analyses, legal documents I'd printed from the county website. "Garrett, we appreciate everything, but there's nothing we can do. We can't afford $260,000, and even if we could get the money somehow, there's going to be an open house in 6 hours. Someone's going to outbid us." "Maybe," I said, "or maybe we make sure that doesn't happen." Maya looked up for the first time, something flickering behind the devastation in her eyes. "What do you mean?" I leaned forward, lowering my voice even though the children were absorbed in their morning cartoons. "Victoria and her siblings are counting on this house selling quickly to the highest bidder. They're banking on a feeding frenzy from investors and flippers who see an underpriced property in a gentrifying neighborhood." "Right," Diego said slowly. "That's exactly what's going to happen. Unless," I continued, "potential buyers find reasons to walk away. Unless this house suddenly becomes the least attractive property on the market." Understanding dawned in Maya's eyes first. She'd grown up in a large Filipino family where protecting your own meant getting creative when powerful people tried to push you around. "You want to sabotage the open house." "I want to level the playing field," I corrected. "Victoria's using her advantages, money, connections, legal expertise to screw over a family with 5 kids. I'm suggesting we use our advantages to fight back." "What advantages?" Diego asked, but he was leaning forward now, interested despite himself. I smiled, thinking of the network I'd built over 30 years in construction, the relationships forged through shared labor and mutual respect. "We've got something the Pemberton Hayes family doesn't have and can't buy. We've got community." Over the next 3 hours, while Victoria presumably prepared for her profitable open house, I made phone calls. Not to lawyers or real estate agents or anyone else who charged by the hour, but to the people who actually made this neighborhood work. Ruby Chen was my first call. At 73, Ruby had been organizing block parties, neighborhood watches, and political campaigns since before Victoria was born. She'd immigrated from Taiwan in the 1960s with nothing but determination and a willingness to fight for what was right. "Those bastards," Ruby said when I explained the situation. Her voice carried the particular venom reserved for people who prey on families. "Alina's probably spinning in her grave. What do you need me to do?" "Can you mobilize the Millbrook Street network?" I asked. "I need bodies, vehicles, and as much chaos as we can legally create." "Consider it done." My next call went to Tommy Morrison, president of our local rugby club and owner of the loudest, most obnoxious motorcycle in 3 counties. Tommy was the kind of friend who'd help you move a couch or hide a body with equal enthusiasm, no questions asked. "Revenge against rich assholes who fuck over working families." Tommy's laugh was like gravel in a cement mixer. "Mate, that's practically a moral obligation. How many lads do you need?" "As many as you can get on short notice. And Tommy, tell them to dress down. We want to look like exactly the kind of neighbors rich people don't want living next door." The third call was to my younger brother Kenny, who ran a landscaping business and had access to certain aromatic materials that could be useful for our purposes. You want me to bring what now? Kenny asked, laughing so hard I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Just trust me, I said, and bring that old couch you've been meaning to take to the dump. By noon, I had commitments from 36 people, not counting family members who'd be dragged along for moral support. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Make 47 Millbrook Street the least appealing property any potential buyer had ever seen, while staying just on the right side of legal. Maya and Diego listened to my explanations with expressions that shifted from despair to hope, to something approaching glee. This could actually work, Maya said, the first smile I'd seen from her since Friday crossing her face. But what if we get caught? What if Victoria figures out what we're doing? That's the beauty of it, I explained. Everything we're planning is perfectly legal. Neighbors having a barbecue in their front yard, community members driving down a public street, bad smells that might or might not be related to legitimate plumbing issues. There's nothing Victoria can do to stop us. Diego was studying the neighborhood map I'd drawn, marking the locations where various elements of our plan would unfold. And you really think this will work? You think we can actually scare off every potential buyer? I think, I said, gathering up the papers and standing to leave, that we're about to find out exactly how much this community values protecting its own. As I headed for the door, Maya called after me. Garrett, why are you doing this? I mean, really, you could get in trouble, you could make enemies of some very powerful people. Why risk it for us? I paused in the doorway, thinking of Alina's garden and Sunday morning conversations, of watching the Santos children grow up in a house their parents had transformed with love and hope. Because, I said finally, some things are worth fighting for, and because Alina would have done the same thing. The next 4 hours passed in a blur of preparation that felt like organizing the world's most righteous heist. Maya and Diego threw themselves into the plan with the desperate energy of people who'd found an alternative to despair, while I coordinated moving pieces across the neighborhood like a general positioning troops for battle. At 3:47 p.m., 23 minutes before the open house was scheduled to begin, I stood in the Santos family's front yard and surveyed our handiwork with satisfaction. Everything was in place. Phase 1 of the war against Victoria Pemberton Hayes was about to begin. At exactly 4:00 p.m., Victoria Pemberton Hayes arrived at 47 Millbrook Street in a silver BMW that probably cost more than Diego made in 2 years. She stepped out wearing the kind of outfit that suggested she dressed for success rather than comfort. Designer heels that would struggle with the cracked sidewalk, a cream-colored blazer that would show every speck of dirt, and jewelry that caught the afternoon light like semaphore signals advertising her wealth. What Victoria found waiting for her was not the quiet suburban street she'd remembered from her childhood visits to her mother's house. The first thing she noticed, how could she not, was the smell. Maya had started with Kenny's suggestion of boiled cabbage, filling the largest pot she owned with water and an entire head of the most pungent cabbage Ruby Chen could find at the Asian market. The sulfurous stench rolled out of the kitchen window like a toxic cloud, but that was just the opening act. Ruby had provided the next layer, a mixture of fish sauce and ammonia that she'd strategically placed near the front and back doors, creating the unmistakable aroma of territorial cats marking their domain. The smell hit you in waves, each breath bringing fresh appreciation for exactly how unpleasant concentrated organic compounds could be. But the masterpiece was Kenny's contribution. 24 rotten eggs, aged to perfection in his truck for 3 days of unusually warm weather, had been poured down the storm drain directly in front of the house. The result was a sewer gas bouquet that made your eyes water and your gag reflex activate. Victoria's reaction was everything I'd hoped for. She actually stumbled backward, one hand pressed to her nose, her composed professional demeanor cracking like cheap paint. "Jesus Christ," she muttered, loud enough for me to hear from my position across the street where I was pretending to work on my truck's engine. "What the hell is that smell?" But the olfactory assault was just the opening salvo. As Victoria fumbled with her key to unlock the front door, she became aware of the acoustic environment we'd created. Tommy Morrison sat on his motorcycle in the driveway next door, revving the engine periodically while adjusting something that didn't need adjusting. The bike was a 1973 Harley that Tommy had deliberately kept in a state of maximum volume, and every rev sent thunder rolling down the street. From two houses down, someone was playing music. Not aggressively loud, but just at the volume level that suggested neighbors who didn't understand the concept of consideration. The song was something with heavy bass that made windows rattle slightly. And then there was the traffic. Ruby had mobilized the Millbrook Street phone tree with military precision. Every 5 minutes, another car would cruise slowly down the street. Neighbors running suddenly urgent errands, family members making visits that couldn't wait, friends who decided this was the perfect time to explore the neighborhood. Each car drove just slowly enough to suggest that this was normal traffic for the area, that Millbrook Street was a busy thoroughfare rather than the quiet residential road it actually was. Victoria managed to get the front door open just as the first potential buyers arrived. A young couple in a Honda Civic who took one whiff of the air and exchanged a look that needed no translation. "Maybe we should come back later," the woman suggested, but her boyfriend was already backing toward their car. "The listing said there might be some minor plumbing issues," he said diplomatically. "I think we might want to factor in major renovations." They were gone before Victoria could even introduce herself. I allowed myself a small smile as I watched 3 more cars drive past the house without stopping. The next potential buyers lasted slightly longer. A middle-aged man in an expensive suit who actually made it to the front door before the combination of sewage smell and motorcycle noise sent him retreating to his Lexus. But Victoria was stubborn, and she'd dealt with difficult sales before. She propped open the front door to air out the house, set up her tablet and paperwork on the kitchen table, and prepared to wait for more serious buyers. That's when she discovered what we'd done to the interior. Maya and Diego had spent the morning implementing my suggestions for making the space feel as cramped and undesirable as possible. Every piece of furniture had been moved away from the walls and clustered toward the center of each room, creating an obstacle course that made the house feel half its actual size. They'd borrowed additional furniture from neighbors, a hulking entertainment center that Ruby's son didn't need, extra chairs from Tommy's garage, a collection of mismatched bookcases that created visual chaos. The walls were covered with Tommy's contribution, his collection of motorcycle memorabilia, photos of bikes, vintage racing posters, and what appeared to be several leather jackets hanging from hooks created the impression that the house was occupied by someone with very specific and potentially concerning interests. "This is different than I remembered," Victoria murmured to herself, trying to navigate between an oversized coffee table and a recliner that belonged in someone's man cave. But the piece de resistance was the couch. Kenny had outdone himself finding the most disgusting piece of furniture in existence, a brown plaid monstrosity that looked like it had been rescued from a flood, complete with stains of uncertain origin and stuffing protruding from multiple tiers. We'd positioned it prominently in Ruby's front yard, directly across from the Santos house, creating the impression that the neighborhood aesthetic ran toward college students on a beer budget. The couch was clearly visible from the Santos front windows, and I watched Victoria's face as she processed what this said about property values in the immediate area. That's when the barbecue started. Tommy's rugby club began arriving at 4:30, exactly on schedule. 12 large men on motorcycles, wearing their most intimidating gear and carrying coolers full of beer. They parked their bikes in the neighbor's driveway, with permission, of course, and began setting up what appeared to be an impromptu party. The grill was borrowed from my backyard, and the smell of cooking meat provided a welcome relief from the sewer gas still emanating from the storm drain. But the visual impact was what mattered. A crowd of leather-wearing, beer-drinking bikers who looked like they'd stepped out of central casting for a movie about motorcycle gangs. "Afternoon," Tommy called out to Victoria when she appeared on the front porch, clearly trying to assess this new development. "Lovely day for a barbecue, isn't it?" Victoria's smile was tighter than shrink wrap. "Yes, it's quite festive. Do you live in the neighborhood?" "Oh, we're around," Tommy replied vaguely, cracking open a beer with the bottle opener on his keychain. "We get together here most weekends. Sometimes the parties run pretty late, but that's just how we like to unwind, you know." I watched Victoria's face as she processed this information. Weekend parties, motorcycles, late nights. Everything a family-oriented buyer would want to avoid, and everything an investor would factor into rental prospects and resale value. The next wave of potential buyers included a family with two young children who took one look at the barbecue crowd and didn't even get out of their car. A real estate investor who actually made it inside the house spent less than 3 minutes touring the property before emerging with a confused expression and driving away without speaking to Victoria. By 5:15, only one serious prospect remained. A man in his 40s who'd arrived in a pickup truck and actually seemed unfazed by the chaos around him. He spent 20 minutes inside the house, asking Victoria detailed questions about the foundation, the electrical system, and the neighborhood's development potential. This was dangerous. This was someone who might see past our theatrical production to the actual value of the property. Which is why Ruby Chen chose that moment to implement the final phase of our plan. Ruby had positioned herself on her front porch with a cup of tea and today's newspaper, playing the role of friendly neighborhood gossip. As the potential buyer emerged from the house, she called out with the kind of helpful enthusiasm that immediately marked her as someone with information to share. "Oh, are you thinking of buying the Santos place?" she asked, standing up and walking toward the fence that separated her yard from the sidewalk. "It's a lovely house, though I suppose you've heard about the drainage issues." The man paused, his interest clearly piqued. Drainage issues. Ruby nodded sagely, launching into a performance worthy of community theater. "Oh yes, it's been an ongoing problem for years. Tree roots getting into the sewer line, backing up into the basement every few months. Poor Maya, that's the tenant. She's constantly dealing with it. Just last week we had another episode. That's probably what you're smelling now." She gestured toward the storm drain, where Kenny's rotten eggs continued their assault on anyone downwind. "The city keeps saying they'll fix it, but you know how that goes. Meanwhile, those poor children have to deal with the smell every time it acts up. And don't get me started on the parties." "Parties?" the man asked, glancing toward the barbecue where Tommy's friends were engaged in what appeared to be a friendly but competitive drinking contest. "Every couple of weeks," Ruby confirmed. "Usually starts around noon on Saturday and goes well into Sunday morning. They're not bad people, mind you, just enthusiastic. Young men, you know how it is. Motorcycles, loud music, the occasional disagreement that spills into the street." She delivered this information with the perfect balance of neighborly concern and resigned acceptance, as if she'd long since given up hope of peace and quiet, but didn't want newcomers to be surprised by what they were getting into. The potential buyer's enthusiasm visibly deflated. I watched him look from the house to the barbecue to Ruby's sincere, helpful face, and I could practically see him calculating repair costs, property values, and the impact of problematic neighbors on future resale potential. "Well," he said finally, "I think I need to do some more research before making any decisions. Thank you for the information." He was gone within minutes, leaving Victoria standing alone on the front porch of a house that had generated 0 serious offers in 2 hours. But our work wasn't finished. The open house was scheduled to run until 6:00 p.m., and Victoria was still hoping for late arrivals who might be willing to overlook the obvious problems. That's when Maya and Diego implemented the final psychological element of our campaign. At 5:45, as Victoria was packing up her materials and trying to salvage something from the afternoon, Maya emerged from the house carrying a large basket of laundry. She began hanging clothes on the makeshift line Diego had strung between 2 trees in the front yard, not because they needed to do laundry, but because it created the visual impression of people who were very much at home and had no intention of leaving. The psychological impact was subtle but devastating. Here was Victoria trying to sell a house while the current tenants went about their daily lives as if nothing had changed. Maya hummed softly as she hung up children's clothes and Diego's work shirts, the picture of domestic contentment. When a final potential buyer arrived, a woman in her 60s who looked like she might be shopping for an investment property, she found herself watching this display of territorial confidence with visible confusion. "Is this normal?" she asked Victoria, "for tenants to be so visible during an open house?" Victoria's smile had become positively glacial. "The current tenants have been here for several years. They're very attached to the property." The woman looked from Maya's cheerful laundry, hanging to the barbecue where Tommy's friends were now engaged in what appeared to be an arm wrestling tournament, to the mysterious brown couch decorating Ruby's front yard. "I think I'll keep looking," she said diplomatically, and disappeared before Victoria could launch into her sales pitch. At 6:00 p.m. sharp, Victoria Pemberton Hayes packed up her materials, locked the front door, and walked to her BMW with the rigid posture of someone barely maintaining professional composure. She'd shown the house to perhaps a dozen potential buyers over 2 hours, and not one had made an offer. Not one had even asked for a second showing. As her car disappeared around the corner, a cheer went up from the barbecue crowd. Ruby applauded from her front porch. Maya and Diego stood in their doorway, holding hands and grinning like teenagers who just pulled off the perfect prank. But I knew this was just the first battle in what would likely be a longer war. Victoria Pemberton Hayes was not the type of woman who accepted defeat gracefully. Monday morning brought a phone call that made it clear she'd figured out exactly what had happened during her disastrous open house. Maya answered the phone to find Victoria's voice stripped of all pretense of civility. "I know what you people did yesterday," Victoria said, her words sharp as broken glass. "That little performance with your neighbors and your theatrical props, very clever." Maya's hand tightened on the phone. "I don't know what you mean. We were just living our normal lives." "Normal lives that include sewer, gas, and motorcycle gangs. Don't insult my intelligence, Mrs. Santos. But here's what you clearly don't understand. I have resources you can't imagine. I can make your life very difficult if you continue to interfere with legitimate business activities." "Are you threatening us?" Maya asked, loud enough for Diego to hear from across the kitchen. Victoria's laugh was cold as winter rain. "I'm explaining reality. You're tenants in a house I own. Your lease expires at the end of this month, and I'm well within my rights to choose not to renew it. I suggest you think very carefully about whether you want to continue playing games with people who hold all the cards." The line went dead, leaving Maya staring at the phone with an expression of renewed fear. That threat changed everything. Until now, our sabotage had been about leveling an unfair playing field. But Victoria's response revealed the true depths of her cruelty. She was willing to make a family with 5 children homeless rather than accept a slightly smaller profit margin. When Maya called to tell me about the conversation, I felt that familiar rage building in my chest, but this time it was coupled with something colder and more dangerous: determination. "She wants to play hardball," I told Maya. "Fine, but she's about to learn that she's not the only one with resources." The next phase of our campaign required more careful planning and deeper community connections. Victoria might have money and legal expertise, but she was fighting on our home ground, surrounded by people who'd known each other for decades and understood that sometimes you have to get creative to protect what matters. My first call was to Ruby Chen, who'd spent 40 years building relationships with everyone from city councilmen to building inspectors. "I need a favor," I told her, "and it needs to be completely legitimate, completely legal, and completely devastating." Ruby's laugh carried the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting her entire life for this exact moment. "Oh, Garrett, you have no idea how long I've been waiting for someone to give me an excuse to deploy the full power of civic engagement." What Ruby understood, and what Victoria had clearly never considered, was that owning property comes with responsibilities as well as rights. The city had regulations about everything from building codes to business licenses, and those regulations were enforced by people who lived in neighborhoods like ours. Within 24 hours, Ruby had marshaled an army of concerned citizens to examine 47 Millbrook Street with the thoroughness of forensic investigators. The house that had been a comfortable family home for 15 years suddenly became the subject of intense scrutiny from people who understood exactly which city departments to call about which potential violations. The first complaint came from Mrs. Patterson, who lived 3 houses down and had noticed that the address numbers on the Santos house were slightly faded and might not meet current visibility requirements for emergency services. She filed a formal complaint with the city's building department, citing safety concerns. The second complaint came from Ruby herself, who reported that the property might have unpermitted modifications to the electrical system. This wasn't true. Diego's electrical work had all been properly permitted, but it triggered an automatic inspection requirement that would tie up the sale for weeks. The third complaint was pure genius. Someone reported that the property might be operating as an illegal short-term rental based on the unusual level of traffic observed during the recent open house. This triggered an investigation by the city's business licensing department, complete with unannounced inspections and interviews with neighbors. Each complaint was perfectly legitimate, filed by concerned citizens exercising their civic rights. Each one required official response from city departments that were understaffed and overwhelmed. And each one created paperwork that would delay any potential sale while the issues were investigated and resolved. But Ruby's masterstroke was yet to come. "You know," she told me over coffee Wednesday morning, "I've been thinking about Aliner's garden. She spent so much time cultivating those roses, and now they're completely neglected. It's really quite sad." I looked across the street at Aliner's former house, where Victoria had hired a property management company to maintain basic upkeep while the sale was pending. The garden that had been Aliner's pride and joy was indeed looking shabby, but I wasn't sure why Ruby was bringing this up. "Here's the thing," Ruby continued. "Aliner planted several heritage rose varieties that are actually quite rare. Some of them might even be historically significant. It would be a shame if they were destroyed by accident during any future renovations." Understanding dawned slowly. "Ruby, are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that heritage roses deserve protection. In fact, I believe there's a city ordinance about preserving historically significant landscaping. It might require a formal assessment by the Historical Preservation Society before any changes can be made to the property." I stared at her in admiration. A historical preservation review could tie up the property for months, requiring botanical assessments, public hearings, and approval from multiple city committees. Even if the roses weren't ultimately deemed historically significant, the process would create enough delays and complications to make any investor think twice about the purchase. "Ruby," I said finally, "you are absolutely diabolical." "Thank you, dear. I consider that quite a compliment." By Thursday morning, Victoria had received notification of 6 separate city investigations related to 47 Millbrook Street. Each one required responses, documentation, and coordination with various city departments. Each one created uncertainty about when, or if, the property could legally be sold. That's when Victoria made her first tactical error. Frustrated by the bureaucratic maze suddenly surrounding her mother's simple house sale, she called Ruby directly, apparently hoping to resolve the complaints through personal negotiation. "Mrs. Chen, this is Victoria Pemberton Hayes. I understand you filed some concerns about my property on Millbrook Street." Ruby's voice was pure innocence. "Oh yes, dear. I hope you don't mind, but I've been so worried about safety issues. Aliner always kept everything in perfect order, but since she passed away, well, I just felt responsible for keeping an eye on things." "These complaints are obviously frivolous," Victoria said, her patience clearly wearing thin. "I think we both know what's really going on here." "I'm sorry, I don't understand. Are you suggesting that citizen concerns about building safety and historical preservation are somehow inappropriate?" Victoria's voice sharpened. "I'm suggesting that this sudden flurry of complaints is coordinated harassment designed to interfere with a legitimate business transaction." "My goodness," Ruby replied, her tone shifting to wounded dignity. "That's quite an accusation. Are you saying that long-time residents of this neighborhood don't have the right to ensure our community remains safe and historically preserved?" It was beautiful to listen to. Ruby was giving Victoria just enough rope to hang herself, and Victoria was taking it eagerly. "Look," Victoria said, "perhaps we can work something out. I'm sure these issues can be resolved more quickly if we approach them cooperatively." "Cooperatively?" Ruby asked. "What exactly are you proposing?" And that's when Victoria made her second tactical error, one that would prove far more costly than the first. "Perhaps you could help me understand what it would take to expedite these reviews. I'm sure there are ways to move things along more efficiently." The silence on Ruby's end stretched long enough for Victoria to realize she might have just crossed a line. "Mrs. Pemberton Hayes," Ruby said finally, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who'd been organizing community responses since before Victoria was born. "Are you suggesting that I should use my civic relationships to circumvent proper regulatory procedures? Because that sounds very much like you're asking me to engage in corruption." "No, that's not what I meant. Because if that is what you're suggesting, I think the appropriate response would be to report this conversation to the relevant authorities." City officials take very seriously any attempts to interfere with proper regulatory processes. Victoria's hasty backtracking was almost painful to hear. Of course not. I would never suggest anything inappropriate. I simply meant that perhaps there were standard procedures I wasn't aware of. Oh, there are standard procedures, Ruby confirmed cheerfully. They involve patience, proper documentation, and respect for the regulatory process. I'm sure someone with your legal background understands the importance of following procedures correctly. When Victoria hung up, she'd not only failed to resolve any of the pending complaints, but had also provided Ruby with ammunition for future battles. Any hint that Victoria was trying to pressure city officials or circumvent proper procedures would only generate more scrutiny and more delays. But the real victory came Friday afternoon, when Maya received a very different kind of phone call. "Mrs. Santos, this is James Morrison from First National Bank. I understand you were pre-approved for a home loan recently." Maya's heart sank. If the bank was calling to rescind their loan approval, our efforts had been wasted. "Yes," she said carefully, "though I understand the property price has changed." "Actually, that's why I'm calling. We've been monitoring the situation with 47 Millbrook Street, and we're aware of the various regulatory issues that have arisen. Given the uncertainty about when the property might actually be available for sale, we wanted to discuss some options that might help." Maya gestured frantically for Diego to pick up the extension. "What kind of options?" Diego asked. "Well, there's considerable risk for any lender when a property has unresolved regulatory issues. Normally, we'd advise buyers to wait until those issues are cleared up before proceeding. But in this case, given your long history with the property and the community support you clearly have, we might be willing to work with you on a different approach." "I don't understand," Maya said. "The current asking price reflects a premium for a property that can close quickly without complications. But if the property is going to be tied up in regulatory review for months anyway, that premium doesn't make sense. If you're willing to wait for the regulatory issues to be resolved, we might be able to help you negotiate a more realistic price." Maya and Diego exchanged looks of cautious hope. "How realistic?" Diego asked. "Let's put it this way," the banker said. "If the sellers are motivated to close this deal before the regulatory review drags on for 6 months or more, they might find your original offer much more attractive than they did last week." After Maya hung up, she called me immediately. "Garrett," she said, her voice shaking with excitement, "I think it's working. I think we might actually be able to do this." But I knew Victoria Pemberton Hayes well enough by now to understand that she wouldn't surrender without one final, desperate gambit. And I was right. Victoria's last desperate move came at us sideways, the way the most dangerous attacks always do. Saturday morning, Maya was hanging laundry in the backyard when her daughter Carmen came running from the front yard, her 15-year-old face pale with confusion and fear. "Mom, there's a man taking pictures of our house," Carmen said. "He's got a clipboard and he keeps writing things down." Maya dropped the sheet she'd been hanging and hurried to the front window, where she found a man in a city uniform photographing the house from multiple angles while making notes on an official-looking form. My phone rang 3 minutes later. "Garrett, there's a building inspector here," Maya said, her voice tight with anxiety. "He says he's received complaints about illegal modifications and unpermitted work. He wants to come inside and examine the electrical system." My blood turned to ice water. This wasn't part of our plan. Our complaints had been carefully crafted to create delays without triggering actual inspections that could uncover legitimate problems. But Victoria had clearly done her research and found a way to turn our own weapons against us. "Don't let him in," I said immediately. "You have rights. Ask to see the complaint, ask for documentation of what specific violations he's investigating. He says if I don't cooperate, he'll have to assume I'm hiding something and recommend that the city condemn the property as potentially unsafe." The bastards. Victoria had found the one angle we hadn't protected against, using the regulatory system not to delay the sale, but to disqualify the buyers. If the city found unpermitted electrical work that Diego had done himself over the years, even though it was perfectly safe, it could trigger code violations that would make the property unmortgageable. Maya and Diego couldn't buy a house the bank wouldn't finance, and they couldn't afford the thousands of dollars it would cost to bring everything up to current code standards. "Stall him," I said. "Tell him you need to contact your attorney. I'm on my way." I made 2 phone calls while driving to Millbrook Street. The first was to Ruby, who confirmed my suspicions. "Oh yes," she said grimly. "Victoria called the city yesterday, claiming she discovered evidence of unpermitted electrical work during the open house. She provided them with photos and a very detailed complaint." "Photos of what?" "Interior shots showing Diego's repairs to the kitchen outlets. Apparently, she knows enough about building codes to identify work that doesn't look professionally installed." My second call was to the one person I knew who could match Victoria's legal expertise with our street-level knowledge. "Kenny," I said when my brother answered, "I need you to find Jimmy Kowalski right now and get him to Millbrook Street immediately. Tell him it's an emergency and I'll pay whatever his hourly rate is." Jimmy Kowalski wasn't just the best building inspector in the city. He was also a neighbor who'd grown up 3 blocks from where I lived, someone who understood the difference between dangerous violations and bureaucratic nitpicking. More importantly, Jimmy owed me a favor from the time I'd helped his son get a union apprenticeship when other contractors wouldn't give the kid a chance. I arrived at 47 Millbrook Street to find Maya and Diego standing in their front yard, looking helpless while the official inspector continued his documentation. The man was being thorough, photographing not just the house but the neighborhood context, the property lines, even the infamous couch still decorating Ruby's front yard. "Mr. Santos," I said, walking up with the confidence of someone who belonged there. "Garrett Thorne, your electrical contractor. I understand there are some questions about the work we did here." The inspector looked up from his clipboard. "Are you licensed in this jurisdiction?" 28 years, I replied, pulling out my wallet to show him my current license. "All the work on this property was done to code and properly inspected. Do you have the permit numbers you're investigating?" This was a calculated bluff. Some of Diego's work had been permitted, some hadn't, but the inspector wouldn't necessarily know which was which without checking city records. "I have a complaint alleging unpermitted modifications to the electrical system," the inspector said. "The complainant provided photographic evidence of work that appears to be non-professional installation." "Could I see those photos?" I asked. "Because if someone's alleging that permitted work was done illegally, that's a serious accusation against my company's reputation." The inspector hesitated, clearly caught between his official duties and his recognition that he was wading into a situation more complicated than a simple code violation. That's when Jimmy Kowalski's truck turned the corner, moving faster than residential street speeds typically allowed. Jimmy parked behind the official inspector's car and emerged wearing his own city uniform, complete with badge and clipboard. At 55, Jimmy had the kind of presence that came from 3 decades of construction experience and absolute confidence in his expertise. "What's the situation here?" Jimmy asked, approaching with the casual authority of someone who outranked everyone present. "Inspector Morrison, Building Department," the first inspector replied. "I'm investigating a complaint about unpermitted electrical modifications." "Jimmy Kowalski, Senior Inspector," Jimmy replied, showing his badge. "What's your investigation number? I'll need to coordinate with your report." Inspector Morrison looked confused. "Investigation number." "For the formal investigation file. When Building Department receives complaints about licensed contractor work, we follow specific protocols to ensure proper documentation. You did verify that the work was done by unlicensed individuals before initiating field investigation, correct?" I watched Morrison's confidence begin to crumble as he realized he might have skipped some procedural steps. "The complaint indicated." "The complaint indicated what specifically?" Jimmy interrupted, pulling out his own clipboard. "Because if we're investigating potential violations by a licensed contractor, that's a formal process with very specific documentation requirements. I need to see your initial assessment report and the verification that preliminary permit research was completed." Morrison was clearly out of his depth. He'd responded to Victoria's complaint without understanding that investigating licensed contractor work required different procedures than checking DIY violations. "Perhaps we should coordinate our reports," Jimmy continued smoothly. Why don't you show me what you've documented so far, and I'll verify it against the permit records I have in my truck? While Jimmy led Inspector Morrison away for a conference that would undoubtedly reveal the procedural gaps in his investigation, I turned to Maya and Diego. How much of Diego's electrical work was actually permitted? I asked quietly. Most of it, Diego replied. We pulled permits for the kitchen outlets and the bathroom fan. The only thing we didn't permit was replacing some switches in the kids' bedrooms. How much would it cost to bring those up to code? Maybe $300 for a licensed electrician to inspect and certify the work. I nearly laughed with relief. Victoria had launched her nuclear option over what amounted to a minor paperwork issue. 20 minutes later, Jimmy returned from his consultation with Inspector Morrison. Well, Jimmy announced, it appears there was some confusion about the scope of this investigation. Inspector Morrison will be filing a report recommending that the property owner obtain verification certificates for some minor electrical updates, but there are no code violations that would affect the property's habitability or mortgageability. Inspector Morrison nodded reluctantly. The work appears to be competently performed. The main issue is documentation to ensure compliance with current permitting requirements. How long does that process typically take? I asked. 2 to 3 weeks for routine certification, Jimmy replied, assuming no complications. Maya and Diego sagged with relief, but I knew this was just Victoria's opening move. She'd established that she was willing to use official channels to attack them directly, and she'd probably learned enough from this attempt to make her next move more effective. But Victoria had also made a critical tactical error. She'd revealed her desperation. The regulatory delays were working. The complete failure of her open house had convinced her that she needed to eliminate Maya and Diego as potential buyers entirely, rather than simply waiting for a better offer from someone else. That desperation was about to become her downfall. Sunday evening, I received a phone call that changed everything. Garrett, this is James Morrison from First National Bank. I have some interesting news about the Millbrook Street property. Good news or bad news? That depends on your perspective. We've been monitoring the situation, and it appears the sellers are becoming quite motivated to close this deal quickly. What do you mean? Victoria Pemberton Hayes called our commercial lending department this afternoon. Apparently, she's been carrying significant debt secured by her real estate portfolio, and the delays in selling her mother's properties are creating some cash flow issues. I sat up straighter. Cash flow issues. Let's just say that people who leverage their assets to maximize investment returns sometimes find themselves in difficult positions when those assets don't sell as quickly as anticipated. What kind of difficult positions? The kind where they become very interested in accepting reasonable offers from qualified buyers, even if those offers are somewhat lower than their initial asking price. My grin was probably visible from space. How much lower? I think, James Morrison said carefully, that your friends might be surprised by how flexible the sellers are willing to be. Monday morning, Maya received a phone call from Victoria Pemberton Hayes. But this Victoria sounded very different from the woman who'd threatened them a week earlier. Mrs. Santos, I've been thinking about our situation, and I believe we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. I'd like to discuss a more collaborative approach to resolving this matter. Maya looked at Diego and put the phone on speaker. I'm listening, Maya said carefully. The various regulatory issues surrounding the property have created some complications for all of us. Rather than letting this drag on indefinitely, I think it might be beneficial for everyone if we could reach an agreement that works for your family and allows us to move forward. What kind of agreement? Victoria's pause was long enough to make clear how much this was costing her. I understand your family has been saving to purchase this property for quite some time. I'd like to honor my mother's original intention by offering you the opportunity to buy at the price she originally quoted. Diego grabbed Maya's hand, his eyes wide with disbelief. You mean $180,000? Maya asked. $180,000, Victoria confirmed, the words clearly painful for her to say. With the understanding that you would handle any necessary permits or certifications as part of the normal buying process. Maya looked at me, and I nodded encouragingly. We'd need to have our bank review the terms, Maya said. Of course, I think you'll find that we're prepared to be quite accommodating with the details. After Victoria hung up, Maya and Diego sat in their kitchen staring at each other in stunned silence. Did that really just happen? Diego asked finally. I said. Victoria just discovered that there are some battles you can't win with money alone. But I knew the real lesson was simpler than that. Sometimes the best revenge is just refusing to be the victim. The closing on 47 Millbrook Street took place on a Thursday morning in December, exactly 6 months after Alina Whitmore's death. Maya and Diego signed the papers with hands that shook slightly, still not quite believing that their 15-year dream was finally becoming reality. Victoria Pemberton Hayes was notably absent from the closing, having sent her attorney to handle the final details. I heard later that she'd sold the rest of Alina's properties at below-market prices, apparently needing cash more than she needed maximum profits. The regulatory issues that had tied up the sale were resolved within weeks once Victoria became motivated to cooperate rather than obstruct. Ruby's Heritage Rose investigation concluded that while Alina's roses were beautiful, they weren't historically significant enough to warrant preservation orders. The building department certified that all electrical work met current safety standards. The business licensing department found no evidence of illegal short-term rental activity. Maya and Diego made their first mortgage payment in January, and Maya cried when she wrote the check, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally building equity instead of just paying rent. The Santos children had their own bedrooms for the first time in their lives. Carmen, now 16, got the room with the best light for her art projects. Marcus claimed the smallest bedroom because he liked the way it felt cozy. Carlos and Isabel, now 9 and 7, shared the room that overlooked the backyard where Diego had built them a swing set. The neighborhood barbecues became a regular tradition. Every few weeks, Tommy's rugby club would gather in someone's front yard for beer and grilled meat and loud stories about games they'd won or lost. The motorcycles were still loud, but now they belonged to people Maya and Diego considered family. Ruby Chen organized a proper garden party the following spring, celebrating both the Santos family's homeownership and Alina's memory. We planted new roses in Alina's former garden, not heritage varieties that might trigger historical preservation reviews, but modern roses chosen for their ability to thrive with minimal care. As for me, I learned something important about the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge is about making someone pay for what they've done. Justice is about making sure that what they've done doesn't succeed. Victoria Pemberton Hayes never got her $260,000. She never got to profit from Alina's kindness or Maya and Diego's vulnerability. She learned that communities have their own forms of power, and that sometimes the people who seem powerless are anything but. But more importantly, a family with 5 children got to keep their home. Alina's promise was honored. The neighborhood that had protected them for a decade got to keep the family that had been part of its heart for so long. 6 months after the closing, I was working in my backyard when I heard familiar sounds from next door. Children laughing, Maya humming while she hung laundry, Diego teaching his sons to repair something that had broken and could be fixed. The sounds of a family that belonged exactly where they were. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to let the bastards win. That's all for now, but we're just getting started. Comment your thoughts, like the video, subscribe, and share this with someone who loves a good story.